So I thought today I would just share some thoughts and some reflections on how is it that we could lean into this idea of a Green New Deal to mobilize climate action in Vermont, but also leaning into the notion of our most vulnerable communities and populations, because that really is the centerpiece to this idea of a Green New Deal. To realize that the New Deal and the Great Society left a lot of people behind, and this is an opportunity to right some of those wrongs. So my talk has three parts. Briefly, what a Green New Deal looks like for the states. What are some of the proposals out there? What's the language? What's the narrative that's being proposed? I actually think it's more than anything a statement of values, and this statement of values is really important for projects like ours. We'll talk a little bit about how we move from these national aspirations to state-level climate action, which is really where the rubber meets the road, and then what it might take to mobilize what some are calling a Green Mountain Deal here in Vermont. So a Green New Deal for the states, you probably have heard of the resolution introduced by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the House of Representatives. And in that House Resolution 109, she and her colleagues put forward the duty of the federal government is to create a Green New Deal to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions through a fair and just transition. So this probably gets the most attention, but it's only one part of the puzzle of the Green New Deal. It's also about jobs, right? This is really a stimulus package. So very much like the New Deal, like the Great Society, like past stimulus packages, most recently under the Obama administration. This is a way to sort of shift not just the amount of work or the amount of employment, but the type of work and the type of employment. It's also a major investment in infrastructure. This seems to be the one thing that the left and the right in the US can agree on, that there are infrastructure needs, but no one seems to go about trying to figure out how to fund it. So this is a value statement on the kind of infrastructure that we need in the 21st century, not just sort of repeating the mistakes like the placement of our most vulnerable communities of the 20th century. And it's a resolution about security for all people. There's a lot in the resolution about not just climate change, but clean air and clean water, community resilience, healthy food, access to nature. There's a lot in there about transitions within agriculture, within energy systems, within home systems. So it's really a comprehensive approach to thinking about the transformation, not just the transition of the US economy. And finally, it's really about justice and equity, stopping current, preventing future, and repairing historic oppression. When I first read this, I was blown away by the boldness of the language and the naming of what the resolution calls our frontline communities, our most vulnerable communities, stretching from communities of color to migrant communities. Here in Vermont, depopulated rural communities, low-income communities, the elderly, the unhoused, people with disabilities. So at the centerpiece of this resolution are 14 different mobilization strategies that are at their heart about justice and equity. So this has gotten a lot of attention. A number of new groups, especially groups with strong youth voices, have bubbled up, including the Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion, some of the old groups like 350 and Friends of Earth, some of the old groups like Sierra Club have really put their might, put their membership, put their funding and their advocacy work behind a Green New Deal, as have representatives and senators in DC, governors across the United States, mayors. It really has become a grassroots conversation about this economic transformation. Of course, we're in the middle of a presidential race here in the US, and groups like Data for Progress have rated all of the Democratic candidates across the different dimensions of the Green New Deal, dimensions around the low carbon economy, clean air and clean water, natural and working land restoration, sustainable and resilient communities, job creation and economic development, social safety nets, and international leadership. So again, I want to stress it's not just about net zero energy, it's about all of these dimensions of an economic and societal transformation. What they've done here is they collected data on 20 of the debate-eligible Democratic candidates along these 48 Green New Deal dimensions, and they sort of rated and ranked the candidates along the way. In fact, more than half of the candidates and all the candidates that are still in the race have publicly endorsed the Green New Deal. So again, it's really about changing the narrative, and it's become more of a statement of values than anything else. Here in Vermont, our own Senator Sanders has probably the most detailed Green New Deal plan. It's the only plan that's actually called the Green New Deal. And it's by far the most ambitious and gets rated the highest in this data for progress exercise. So the Sanders plan is big, and that is the point. The whole idea of the New Deal tag is to imagine a massive, and the words are often used like wartime mobilization, right? A massive infrastructure plan, spending plan, transition plan, that when it's all summed and totaled, the Sanders plan, as an example, has a $16.3 trillion price tag over a 10-year mobilization period, and would produce upwards of 20 million jobs. Not all new jobs, but jobs that would transition away from the 20th century economy to the 21st century economy. This is equivalent to about 6 to 7% of US gross domestic product over the 10-year mobilization period. So it's a chunk of change on purpose. It's meant to be a massive mobilization of resources. The 20 million jobs would be about a 13% growth in jobs over the current 151 million jobs in the US. Just for perspective, the old New Deal under Franklin Delano Roosevelt was about a 22% growth in jobs. So a little over half of the job growth is anticipated in this kind of spending. The Clinton years, the 8 years under Clinton, actually it's the most job creation of any two-term president in the US, was about a 15.6% increase, or 18.6 million jobs were created under 8 years of Clinton. Obama administration, from the bottom of the Great Recession, produced about 16 million jobs, or about a 12% increase. So you're in that kind of range of both Clinton and Obama administration job plans. This $6.3 trillion would transform about 1/4 of the federal budget. So this isn't like nipping around the edges. This is meant to be a massive mobilization of resources. In comparison to military mobilizations, the U.S. defense budget peaked at 41% of GDP during World War II. 41%. Hit 10% of GDP during the peak of the Cold War, and most recently was 5% of GDP during the surge in Iraq. So, and much of the funding that proposed under the Sanders plan would be to shift much of that military spending over to peacetime spending on this economic transformation. So, from national aspirations to state climate action, barring a Sanders or Warren win in DC, it's hard to wrap your head around how this would emanate from Washington, DC. However, states are already taking up this challenge of transforming their own economies under the aspirations of a Green New Deal. Governors from New York, New Mexico, Washington, and Maine have all created state-level Green New Deal plans. You're probably familiar with the U.S. Climate Alliance. This was formalized in the wake of Trump's announcement to pull out of the Paris Agreement. It represents state commitments to reach the Paris goals of 26 to 28% below 2005 greenhouse gas levels by 5 years from now, 2025. It's now a coalition of 25 governors, which includes 24 states and Puerto Rico, that collectively make up, and this is important to keep in mind, 55% of the U.S. population, 60% of U.S. GDP, and 40% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. That's equivalent, that coalition is equivalent to the 6th largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. So it's no small chunk. And the latest report from the U.S. Climate Alliance has found that collective greenhouse gas emissions by this group of states has decreased by 16% compared to 7% for the rest of the country. There's also regional initiatives that fit really well with the Green New Deal philosophy. Here in Vermont, we're part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that is focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from electricity. There's the new Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is a cooperation amongst the RGGI states to address the biggest nut to crack, which is greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, especially here in Vermont. And here in Vermont, New Hampshire, Rights and Democracy is leading a conversation about what a New England Green New Deal would look like. So there's a lot of conversations in space around this idea of transforming our economy to a climate-friendly way and as a just transition. So mobilizing a Green New Deal here in Vermont, or a so-called Green Mountain Deal, what might that look like? So the act that is getting the most attention in this space was introduced in the Senate, Senate Bill 311 by Anthony Polina, senator from Washington County, an act relating to creating a Vermont Green New Deal fund. This is one of 3 climate action proposals that I've been paying attention to in the current legislation. There's a Global Warming Solutions Act, which recently passed the House in a veto-proof majority, which is good news. There's also Vermont's pending participation in this Transportation Climate Initiative. And then there's this act that would establish a Vermont Green New Deal fund. It focuses on, first and foremost, energy conservation programs, such as weatherization, thermally efficient, renewable energy heating systems. It proposes that it would be administered by a board appointed by the House and Senate leadership, and that board would also include the youth voice, which is a big part of the lobby for a Green Mountain Deal here in Vermont. And it would be funded with income tax surcharge on the highest incomes in Vermont. So I'm going to just unpack those 3 things and then conclude. Its focus on energy conservation really emanates from the Green New Deal strategy of targeting the most vulnerable communities and populations in Vermont. And Efficiency Vermont has done some really excellent work recently around the energy burden, understanding particularly low-income households in rural communities and how their incomes can go towards, on average, in the highest category, 17% of their incomes can go towards energy spending. Energy spending on transportation, energy spending on heating, and energy spending on electricity. New England has the oldest housing stock in the country, and Vermont has the oldest housing stock within Vermont. So we do a really good job in Vermont of heating the outdoors. We're a rural state, so we tend to drive a lot, long commutes to work. And our grid is relatively green. What we don't produce here in state, we have to import from the New England grid, but we're the only state in the country that what we produce is already 100% renewable energy. So this conversation about shifting to electric, getting off of fossil fuel-based heat, oil is the #1 heat source for Vermont right now, and somehow getting ourselves either out of our cars or together in cars or in buses or in light rail to really break this curse of our ruralness and our electricity, our transportation consumption. This bill also really leans into the youth voice. We've been really excited to be a part of a series of Vermont Youth Climate Summits that we've hosted here at the University of Vermont with Senator Sanders' support. That has led to a Vermont Youth Climate Lobby, and most recently a Vermont Youth Climate Congress. And the intent of the Green New Deal bill would be to add a youth voice to the administration of these fundings. But most importantly, how to pay for it. It would be funded with an income tax surcharge on high incomes. We could reprioritize funds within our $6 billion state budget. The challenge is we don't have a big military budget that we can target as they do in the federal plan. We could go after fossil fuel companies, but that really is going to require more than just Vermont. That's also a strategy to fund the national plans. We could issue bonds, we could create energy revolving funds, and there's some really robust conversations happening in the State House around just that. The Polina bill decides to go to the source of the problem, which is high incomes, with an income tax increase. We know that the Trump tax cuts largely went to the richest Americans, including the richest Vermonters. So a big strategy here is to take back some of those tax cuts from the very rich here in Vermont that these tax cuts disproportionately went to, and bring them into a climate action fund such as this Green New Deal fund. We know that overall the U.S. total tax rate, when you include federal, state, and local, for the first time in history has gone regressive and not progressive. So this is a recent analysis done by Emmanuel Saez and his colleagues, and have found that the upper income groups in the U.S. right now are paying less total tax rate than the middle income groups in America, and even the low income groups. They're paying the lowest tax rate in America right now, in part due to both the Bush tax cuts and the legacy from those, but also the more recent Trump tax cuts. And we also know that the richest households in the United States, including here in Vermont, disproportionately spew out the most greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the tons of CO2 equivalent per household in a recent study just published in 2019 that shows this kind of exponential pattern that the richer you are, the more, not less, there's a myth out there that the richer you are, the more efficient you become and the less greenhouse gases you produce. But it turns out that you end up driving more, flying more. High income lifestyles lead to high energy lifestyles. In fact, a 2017 study by the London School of Economics found that the richest 10% of US households produced more CO2 each year from driving than the entire carbon footprint of the poorest 10% of households do over an 8-month period. And we also know that taxes here in our state of Vermont, so this is total state and local taxes paid in Vermont as a share of family income, aren't all that progressive. They're quite flat. So the poor quintiles are paying 8.7 to 9% of their family income on state and local taxes, and the richest 1% or the richest 4% are only paying about 10%. So the Polina bill, if enacted, would target these top 5% of earners, which is only about 15,000 Vermont tax filers. They all got about $240 million in tax cuts per year, those 15,000 households from the Trump administration. This Green New Deal proposal would only take back 10% of what Trump gave them, and it would be taken back from the highest greenhouse gas polluters in Vermont. So it seems like a good deal to me, a Green New Deal. This would generate about $30 million a year, which unfortunately is still just a drop in the bucket. If you look at weatherization, for example, there's a very recent study published by the Vermont Department of Health that looks at all the co-benefits, the health benefits of weatherization. The fact of the matter is we're way behind our statutory goals for weatherizing homes in Vermont. Our statutory goal set in 2007 was to weatherize 80,000 homes by 2020 this year. And right now we're at about 26,000, so less than half of what we set by statutory goals. We know, though, from all that effort that it only costs about $8,500 per home, so $30 million goes a long way. You actually could catch up to the statutory goals quite quickly. And the co-benefits of this is outlined in this report by the Department of Health. All total, the energy and health benefits that a weatherized homes would get over a 10-year period would be about $25,000 for an $8,000 investment. So again, it's a good deal in a Green New Deal. And this is one of the priorities of Senate Bill 311. Lastly, we did some work a few years ago with Energy Action Network, which kicked off our governor's commitment to the Paris Agreement. Looking at all of these kinds of things combined, including here retrofitting buildings, 50,000 homes, heat pumps, advanced wood heat, ride share, increase in fleet miles per gallon, conversion of the fleet to electric vehicles, which is the favorite policy of most policy people in Vermont, more solar, more wind, which currently we effectively have a wind moratorium in Vermont, plus some work in agriculture. All of this together over a 5-year period, which is the mobilization period of the Anthony Polina bill, would be required to hit the Paris Agreement. And $30 million doesn't get us there. So we're probably going to need a combination of a federal Green New Deal, state initiatives in this area. And if I had time, part 2 of the talk would be all about what Tim brought up, is that the focus should be on reducing demand instead of just efficient supply. There's another talk I recently gave about the myth of decoupling, when you get the rebound effects of all these efficiency improvements, the income effects of the energy savings, and the full embodiment of our carbon in our imports. That makes the math even much more difficult to accomplish. So that really shifts us to a kind of second part to this conversation, which would be the benefits of degrowth and a steady state economy. And maybe at some point, talk about that. So thank you.